Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore Presents. In this episode, I'm really pleased to be talking to Marion Gibson, who writes accurate, engaging books about witches and magic in history. She's been interested in witches for over 30 years, since she read the words of women accused of witchcraft in Elizabethan England. Why were they accused of crimes they didn't commit, and why did they confess? Marion's books tell the stories of these women and the men accused alongside them, and she explores the wider history of witch trials, folklore, magical and pagan beliefs, and things that go bump in the night. So we will be talking about her book, Witchcraft, A History in 13 Trials, some surprising moments from some of these specific trials, how we often end up reading the witch trials through the lens of our own experience, and how we're perhaps not as far away from the paranoia as the witch trials as we might like to think that we are. Enjoy. Hello and welcome to Fabulous Folklore.
Hello, I see.
It's so lovely to have you here. And I'm just going to show this off straight away. We're going to be talking about this fabulous book in particular. Obviously, this is Witchcraft in 13 Trials. Because I've just realised for the podcast listeners, me holding a book up is pointless. So you've got 13 different trials in here from I think it's 1485 to present day. How on earth did you decide how you're going to include what stories and so on? Like, how did you work out which one you want to include?
It was really hard. Yeah, it was really, really difficult because, of course, there are so many witchcraft trials in history, and that's like a 700-year period, all the way through from the period of the witch trials, as we tend to think of it, right the way through to uses of the phrase witch trial, witch hunt in contemporary life, and everything in between. So it's really hard. But what I tried to do was draw together certain themes across the book. So I tried to pick trials that picked up on the same sort of themes, like what type of person is accused, are they disadvantaged by their society in some way? So that was a big theme, whether that's about gender or race and ethnicity or disability or whatever it is. I tried to pick trials where it was a really obvious conflict between different groups of people. I tried to pick trials that were a bit surprising sometimes as well. So whilst they went along with my main themes of, discrimination and hatred, oh great, what lovely themes those are, also ones where somebody fought back or somebody was accused who didn't expect to be accused, or something exciting happened that pushed the trial right off its normal route. So I tried to make it a book that explores the big themes that draw together the idea of the witch trial over history, but to have some nice little nuggets for readers where they would think, oh, I didn't expect that story to go that way as well.
Speaking of which, I think it was really interesting to see where the witch trials kind of start almost at the same time as like the Malleus Maleficarum, because obviously I think a lot of people will have heard of that and not realize that obviously at some point somebody has to write it. And I really, really, really enjoyed the Helena Schuberin chapter. Could because she's like my favorite. And it sounds like a weird thing to say, but I suppose because obviously, spoiler alert, like hers isn't one of the oh my god, which way does this want to go kind of cases. How would you briefly sum up Helena Schuberin for anyone who didn't know who she was?
So, yeah, I like her too. I don't think that's at all unfair to say that could be a favourite trial. She's a upper middle class Austrian woman living in Innsbruck in the 1480s. And she comes to the attention of history because she's accused by Heinrich Kramer, the primary and indeed many people argue only author of the Demonology Malleus Maleficarum, the witch hunting manual. She comes to his notice and he accuses her of witchcraft and holds a big trial in Innsbruck in 1485, where she is the kind of star accused, and subsequently the trial goes in ways that perhaps we don't expect it to do. When you see the opposition between this very powerful Dominican monk who he's an inquisitor, he has the Pope behind him, he's a big cheese basically, and you kind of expect everything to go his way, and it doesn't, because Helena is a really exceptional and interesting woman, and she speaks up for herself. She fights back. She accuses him of things. She gets a lawyer. So she does some really brilliant things, and I think it's quite fair to say she's kind of a favourite character in the book, if you like. She's a real woman. We have some of her words that are preserved because of her activities during the course of the trial, and she really does stand out as somebody who you think that's a really interesting person. I really like to have talked to her and known what she thought about the world. So yeah, I think that's quite fair. You're allowed to like Helena.
I think because when I was reading the chapter, I was like, "Hey, why does she not have a Netflix series yet? This would be brilliant." But secondly, I think the thing that struck me about that one was the fact that the authorities weren't really all that keen necessarily on actually going along with him. Like you would have assumed that they would, but when they're kind of like, "Oh, really?" And I thought that was a really interesting angle because I think we always assume, perhaps from the later trials, that once you're accused, that's it. And I suppose in this one, because it's like the first, as it were, that's not necessarily a foregone conclusion.
No, that's right. And I did want to start the book in that quite surprising place. And it's quite hopeful. It
Hmm.
does actually give you some sense this book is not just a sort of gloom fest of one person after another being accused and killed. That actually there are other ways out of a witch trial. And that's really interesting. So yeah, he comes sweeping in with his papal authority and say, oh, I'm going to do this. He's come there specifically to stage a witch trial as Heinrich Kramer. And he is able to do that. But the local authorities, the people who are responsible to the local bishop, some of the town authorities in Innsbruck, they're really not happy about this outsider coming in with what many of them see as this crazy conspiracy theory. He's an early demonologist. He's not the only one by any means, and people might know that. There are others from around this period who are also bringing forward this conspiracy theory about, massive groups of witches conspiring with Satan and tearing down kings and lords and ruining the crops and all this kind of thing and worshipping the devil. So he's not the only one that's saying that, but he is kind of the first wave of people saying that. And so not everybody is on board with this. The local authorities think this is a bit loopy, actually. And they don't really want him accusing the wives of one of their most prominent merchants and citizens. It's embarrassing for them, it's difficult for them. And the fact that she fights back makes the whole thing it must have convulsed Innsbruck. It must have been so interesting to live through, but also so alarming if you were a woman in that society. And he's come into town, he's preaching about witches, he's looking at the women in his congregation thinking, right, which one of these am I going to accuse? I'm sure some of them are witches. Not a terrifying thing, but yes, it ends somewhat differently than you might expect, which is what I wanted the readers to take away. I really want people to come away from the book thinking, oh, the story is a bit more complicated than I thought. Witch trials are still relevant, they're still going on across the world. So, in Africa, Indonesia, northern India, all over the world, people are still on trial for witchcraft. And I wanted them to come away with that feeling, but I also wanted them to look back to what we think of as the sort of classic period of the witch trials, like the 15th to 18th centuries, and say, well, that history was a bit more complicated than I thought, actually.
Hmm. So you mentioned that some of Helena's words have been preserved, but where do you actually start researching for some of these? Because I know it's like for the Newcastle witch trials, the only real evidence we've got is for part of it is the fact that he's in like hiring the witchfinder is in the accounts, and I
Mm.
love the fact that it's such a boring source has this sort of quite important thing, because obviously I think they were paying for his lodgings or something. So where would you start looking if you were wanting to research something like that long ago?
Yeah, what I have done in each case is to look at the broadest possible group of records. So, like you say, you wouldn't necessarily think to look in, the town council's account book. But if you look there, wow, there's something. And just this morning, I'm reading records of manors in 17th century Suffolk, because at the moment I'm writing a book about the kind of witchfinder general hunts, and I am going to write about Newcastle as part of that. So I'm going to come and look at some of those records at some point, which would be great. But today I'm reading manor records. So I'm reading little land transactions, people who lease an acre here and 6 acres there, and they're trading it amongst themselves. But some of them are the accused people, some of them are the husbands of accused people, others are the accusers. So you can see that. And I always look at parish records. A lot of family historians will go immediately to parish registers, and so do I, because you can find the families of the accused people and their accusers there. And that's one of the few places where you get a really good representation of women in records, because of course they are essential to family structures, and the parish registers are all about family structures. So you can find out who is whose sister and who is whose mother and all that kind of important stuff. And I look at wills and I look at deeds and I look at church court records, and I look at any kind of secondary sources about any of these things. So, anybody who's writing contemporary history or anybody who's worked on it since. So I just read and read and read as much as possible. I think when I search for those kind of records in catalogues, I just look at a date range, actually. I look at a place and a date range, and anything that's within those categories, I have a look at, because you just never know.
Mm. So, can you get a sense of these people actually as people from the records? Because in my head, I'm like, we've obviously got this fabulous record of like community life through like Facebook community groups and the drama that ensues. Do you still get a sense of that in these records as well? Or is it the kind of thing where you've got to sort of piece things together over a period of time?
Yeah, it can be either really, or somewhere in between. I mean, with somebody like Helena, I think you do get a good sense that this is a big personality. This is somebody who speaks a lot, which was unusual for women in her period, asserts herself, has money, is gossiped about by other people. That feels like that's a big, mouthy, interesting personality. In other cases, it's much harder. So, the fact that somebody pays rent to a manor in 17th century Suffolk doesn't necessarily tell you anything about them, but it can tell you about the economic level that they're operating at. And you can sometimes see if people are in trouble in courts in other ways. So, maybe they've had an illegitimate child or they've had an affair with someone, and that's shown up in the church court record. So you get a sense of, oh, that person is seen as a bit difficult, maybe rowing with other people, or they don't really care too much about what the church thinks, and they've got their own life. And that gives you a sense of them as sort of standing outside the community a little bit. I think I always try and get a sense of them as best I can, really. I feel like it's the least you can do after all this time, and they're not units, they're not data points, they're not just a name on a balance sheet. They're a real rounded individual, and just anything that I can dredge up about them, I always want to do that. And I like to get a sense too of the places that they lived in,
Mm.
because while that doesn't tell you everything about a person, obviously it can help you understand what their world was like. So what did they see when they got up every morning? What were the kind of points in their day where they would think, oh, I can hear the church clock striking, or, oh, it's market day on Tuesday. I'll have to go along to that. So I try and get a sense of the texture of their lives where I can, and give people the best possible rounded picture of them that I can. It is different in each case. Record survival is very, very unpredictable, and you can find loads of records, and you can find hardly any records. But I do try and pull out that sense of, this is a real historical individual. This is a person like you and me. And to some extent, that brings with it the suggestion that this could have happened to us too, had we lived in the right period, in the right place, or even if now we lived in the right place.
Mm. I always 100% think, yeah, that would be me. I would be getting accused.
I think a lot of people do. Yeah, when I do a public event, a lot of people say that, and don't know that they're wrong. I think any of us, particularly if we're women, would have found ourselves in a position where, either because of something we had done or not done, or just simply because we were there, we might have found ourselves accused. One of the cases I'm going to write about in the next book is literally, and this is an eerie thing, a witch called Marion Gibson.
Oh,
And
wow.
I think that's so amazing. She's a woman from Calder in Scotland, and there's a group called the Calder Witch Trial Project, who are actually recovering those records of the women who were accused in Calder. And they came to one of my events that I did in Scotland, and they brought me this record. They'd had a photocopy of the record of the woman, and it was just so amazing. It was just such an amazing moment. And there she was. And I think if you can feel that, if you get that shock, oh, she's got my name. That's me. Wow, that's really interesting. It does help you think about these trials in a different way, I think. And that's probably not going to happen if you're a male historian, and it's not going to happen for the majority of people. I think that really matters. I do think you need that emotional investment and that sense of this is awful. This is so unjust. This is shocking. This woman has probably done absolutely nothing wrong at all. Or if she has practiced a bit of magic, yeah, who cares? It's not going to work. So why are these people pursuing her and killing her? And
Mm.
I do think that helps, that sense of the individual as somebody like us.
Yeah. So do you think because there obviously is such this breadth of witch trials, obviously again, like you say, all over the world, but is there one specific reason or is it a combination of factors why some witch trials are better known than
I
others?
think it's a combination of factors, yeah. And the more I look, the more I know how little we know and how little I know about that huge history. There are so many trials, and you can't know about all of them. You've got at least 300 years to look at. And the whole breadth of the world, really. Even if you just kind of narrow that down to, oh, Western Europe and North America, that's huge. And I think there hasn't been the time and there hasn't always been the interest in chasing down all of those records. The project I'm doing at the moment, I was lucky enough to apply for and get some funding to do it. And there's me and there's Tabitha Stanmore, another wonderful historian of magic, working on this together. But it's only because somebody has given us the money to do that we've actually carved out a little bit of time to go to all these record offices and libraries and repositories and actually poke through the folders and the boxes that other people might not have had the time to look at, that we found records of these people. I think there is so much still to be discovered. I just think that's really exciting. And if by talking to people on podcasts and, just kind of drawing attention to this, if I can get people to go along to their local archive and have a look, I'll be so pleased. And I think for your folklorists like you, people just interested in this, the more you raise the profile of this, the better. And I love what you've done with this. I think people like you've really raised the profile of folklore and magic studies. And if it makes people feel empowered to go and do some of that work themselves, isn't that marvelous? So I would really like anybody listening to this who thinks, I would really like to know if there was a witch trial in my community. Have a look, start online, see if you can find anything. Look in some of the older history books, the stuff from sort of the 1960s backwards to Victorian times. Is there anyone mentioned? And then go along to your record office, your library, can you find anything? Is there anything that people haven't looked at, even if it's, a tax return, even if you don't know how to read the writing on it yet, even if you don't know how to read that class of document yet, you can learn, you can find out. I learned from scratch. What can you find out? So I would just so much love people to write more of this history. I think so many villages, so many towns have these stories that we haven't actually accessed before because people haven't had the time or the records haven't showed up. And new stuff turns up all the time, either because people look in a new place for it, or because I mean it must be great working in a record office, I think, because sometimes people just come in and say, "Oh, this was in my attic," and it's a 17th century account book. Wow, and maybe it's got one of those people in it who was accused. Wow, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful type of history to write and to be involved in researching.
It's one of those things as well where I think when you look at, was there a witch trial? I suppose the one thing that then doesn't get captured is if there was just rumors about somebody, but it never went anywhere.
Mm.
And that's the stuff where you sort of think, you might be more likely to find that, I guess, if it's like early 20th century, maybe, and it was like family gossip or something. But I think that's a bit that always kind of annoys me a
Mm.
little bit, that when all that's left is like admin, it's kind of that sort of stuff
That's the thing.
Yeah,
Yeah. It has
disappeared.
to surface in some sort of process. So somebody has to, sometimes you get slander cases, where there is a high enough level of gossip about somebody that they think, right, I'm not putting up with this anymore. People are saying I'm a witch. I'm going to take them to court, and they go to the church court. So you do sometimes get those. But other than that, it's where a formal case has been brought, and that does narrow down the amount of people who are covered by that. And I think there would have been a very high level of gossip actually about people. Yeah, so you can imagine, if you're looking just at the cases that come to court, my goodness me, what else is going on in the community? And actually, I think it's loads. I got the sense. I wrote this book called The Witches of St. Osyth, which is about these Essex villages where people are prosecuted in the Elizabethan period. And I just got the sense that people were just chucking these accusations about quite randomly on a day-to-day basis. There were a lot of people in the community who were working as children's nurses, or they were making pots of ointment for their neighbours, or they were intervening in the community in some sort of way that was seen to be magical, maybe by fortune telling or divining or something like that. And those people weren't accused during the trials, but my goodness, they were being talked about in the statements that were made. So it's like, I'm accusing this woman, but this woman over here as well, I'm going to talk about her too. And maybe she doesn't come to court, but she gets mentioned. And I got the sense that the sort of magical temperature in these communities was really high, actually, that a lot of people thought they were hurling spells at each other, for good or ill. And a lot of people thought that they were using prayers and charms and things to, for medical ends, for example, or to help family members, or to try to find out the future. So I get the sense there's an awful lot going on that isn't documented. Yeah. It's fascinating to think about, isn't it? What a different world that is. Many of the same outcomes in terms of who gets persecuted. We kind of recognize the types of group that do get persecuted in our contemporary society. But if you add that kind of high magical temperature, I think that's what gives you witch trials.
There is one thing that's always confused me, and you might be able to clear this up, but if you genuinely believe that somebody might be a witch and they had magical powers, why would you then risk provoking them by accusing them of witchcraft? I
Yeah.
sort of think, would that not be a person you'd want to
Mm.
stay on the good side of?
Yeah, I think I would. Yes, not being confrontational type, I think I probably would have chosen to ignore that. And a lot of people must have done that. They must have had a strong suspicion that their neighbour had bewitched their pigs, but they weren't going to make an issue of it. So it has to be people who have lost patience and think, oh, right, I am going to challenge this. This is ridiculous. All these things have happened to me, and I am going after this person. Or it's people to whom something so terrible has happened, the loss of a child, for example, or their spouse has died. People who think, well, I've got nothing to lose here. I am going to go after this person who I think has done me this terrible injury. So it's that kind of thing that prompts accusation, I think, in a lot of cases. But there are also troublemakers, and we all know those in contemporary society, don't we? They're disruptors. They want to make a big fuss about things, and they want to go after people, whether they believe them to have been guilty or not, or whether they think it's politically convenient to do so. And those kind of people, I think, play a big role as well. I suppose I'm saying that particularly because I'm thinking about the Witchfinder General hunts at the moment. And whilst I think those people did believe that there were witches in their communities and that they needed to go after them, some of them had an enormous relish for that, which really makes me think about contemporary politics and the way that people will just relentlessly pursue an issue because they think it has some merit. They think it has some mileage. They think they can get something out of it. It makes them feel important. It makes them feel worthy. And I think those kind of people also play a role here. So people who want to stick their head above the parapet because they think they can get something out of attacking somebody else.
It kind of makes me think a little bit of a lot of the modern, well, I say modern, but contemporary vogue for conspiracy theories as well. And you sort of
Yes.
think, was this like the 17th century equivalent of some of the absolutely bonkers stuff that you see going around? And you're like, how could people believe that?
Mm.
But then we have people who believe actually weirder stuff now.
Yeah.
So
I think that's absolutely true. I wouldn't have said that maybe 10 years ago. It's interesting. I've come on quite a journey as a historian because, used to think that this was a period of time very different to ours. And I suppose other historians too would struggle sometimes to understand why people believed these things. We would have all these rationales for, oh, demonology, it fitted into people's everyday lives because it was a very religious society. And if you had God, therefore you had the devil on the other side. And people thought in these binary terms, and you'd have all these kind of rationalizations. But I don't think we felt it in quite the same way. And I think what's changed in the writing of witch trial history over the last 10 years is that we are now living in a period where we can see people believing in what seem to us ludicrous conspiracy theories, and spreading them through a new medium as well. I think print played this kind of role in the 16th and 17th centuries, and now, of course, it's online. And I think it's really helped. And I think the sense of crisis and dislocation and disruption that we've all lived through, whilst painful and vile, has actually been quite useful to historians because it's made us think about the way that world felt and how easy it is for people to act in a way that seems to us irrational, but seems to them to be perfectly fair, and how easy it is for those conspiracy theories to spread, and how an incident like a pandemic or a war, or shortages of some kind, or political polarization can push people into positions where actually they will believe something that maybe a while back they'd have said, oh, no, no, that can't be true. I think that's been quite useful, actually. It's a terrible thing, isn't it? I mean, nobody's any happier for it, but historians have got quite a lot out of it.
So I think you sort of touched on this before, and it's just making me think, well, obviously people who do conspiracy theories just kind of fling mud and it falls where it might. When people were making accusations, and obviously it didn't always get to trial, which I think we possibly assume that it must have done, but there would have been times where someone would have just gone, no, away with you, we've got better things to worry about. Would that accusation have continued to follow that person around? Like, would there have, even if there wasn't any legal ramifications, would there have still been sort of a social impact?
Yeah, I think they would. I think these things stuck just as they do now. And it is astonishing how the mud always sticks to the same people, isn't it? It's always women, it's always poorer people, it's always people who are socially marginalized in some way. There are exceptions, of course, but the great majority of people that we end up looking at in situations where conspiracy theories are being worked through and mud is being slung, it's amazing how often we're looking at the same groups of people. And I think that does follow people around. And once an accusation like that has been made, it's difficult for the community to get it out of their head, even if it's somebody saying something in the local inn, or, somebody's saying something in the marketplace and people hear it. I think it must have been a reputation that was very difficult to shift, just as those things stick now.
Would it have made any difference if they'd actually stood trial but been found innocent? Would that have gone some way to allay in people's fears, do you think?
It might have done. It's hard to tell. I mean, some of the cases I'm looking at the moment, the accuser just goes back and back and keeps on accusing. Um, and they keep going back to court. And eventually, something does stick, and they're executed. So I think from that point of view, some people were always going to believe that they were a witch, whether the court had decided that they weren't or not. But you would hope, wouldn't you, that the wider community might have thought, oh, well, so and so went off to the big court and was judged by the big people, and the big people said that she wasn't a witch. And it would help if somebody stood on your side. We're talking about Helena Scheuberen's case earlier on. A lot of the people in her community, her husband, the other men in his circle, the church officials, they all stood with her. And that really helped. That must have helped her to rebut the accusations and hopefully to move on from them to some extent. So if people stood with you, if people were prepared to believe in reasonable numbers that this accusation was unjust, then you did stand some chance of recovering from it. But I do think it must have hung over people for the rest of their lives. It was so easy to make an accusation,
Mm.
and it came out of nowhere sometimes. It must have been hugely worrying for them, I think.
I think it always makes me feel a bit like people pick on obviously the most vulnerable, but part of the reason why they're vulnerable, and obviously we talk about the different intersections, and obviously there's class, race, and disability and so on. But I also kind of feel like the singlehood one gets forgotten about. I mean, I might be a little bit more sensitive to that than others, but when I look at like the Newcastle witch trials, obviously, like there's a couple of women were just more or less taken out of the process because the husbands came to collect them, and I love that because at least obviously the husbands were like, no, this is silly, but then you do sort of think so if vouch for you, then you were stuck, and I sort of think is that another like level of marginalization that we need to bear in mind because that would also equally apply, I would imagine, to a single man as well.
Yes,
So
yeah, I think that's quite fair. If you've got a big family that surround you and defend you, well, that's going to feel completely different, isn't it, than if you're somebody, maybe you're widowed, or maybe you're single, or maybe you've moved to a new community. Because lots of people were moved around quite forcibly in the early modern period. People had to go into service in a different community, a different household. So quite often you'll have somebody who's a servant in somebody else's house and they haven't got their family around them. There is no one to defend them. They don't have a husband, etc. So yes, I think that's really important. I think it's what I see when I look at these cases is a discussion about relative levels of power. And that can come out in all sorts of different ways in a person's life. And whether you've got a lot of people on your side or not is clearly a factor.
yeah, I think that was the thing because obviously people in the UK might have spotted you on Saran Jones's two-part sort of documentary about it. And I felt that Saran was obviously viewing it very much as an attempt to silence just women. Um, but obviously it kind of felt a bit like trying to apply a 21st century viewpoint to something sort of much earlier. And is there a danger that, and obviously, because I've just said, I obviously look at these as single people and I sort of feel like, oh, they're my people. Is there a danger that we can apply too much of like contemporary thinking to earlier centuries when we have no idea what their mindsets would have been like on a day-to-day basis?
Yes, yes, I think there is. I think it's a really delicate balance, and it's one that I continually keep under review for myself. I think probably in the past I would have emphasize that danger more, I think. But as I said, living through this period of turmoil recently, it's made me think maybe contemporary society does have more to offer in terms of the insights into the past that historians might want to make use of. It is really difficult to it's really difficult to get it right. And I kind of wander over this line constantly thinking, am I just reading too much into this? Or am I thinking only in terms of my own contemporary experience? And I think it helps to look at statistics. So again, record survival is really patchy. So also statistics are not a perfect guide. But if you look, say, at the ratio of men to women in this, in the period sort of, say 1500 to 1800, you see about 75% of the people who we know were accused in the areas where historians have looked at the records and where the records survive, about 75% of those people are female. So that matters. That's a huge overrepresentation. In anybody's terms, that really matters, that imbalance. But it does leave 25%, of course, who were male. So therefore, you've got to balance that. You've got to say, yes, this is mostly women, actually. A lot of contemporary writers, people like Heinrich Kramer, have a huge problem with women, and are continually concerned about their authority and their sexuality and their access to power and so on. But there are also many, many other reasons why people might be accused. And that can include, a man being associated with a woman who's already been accused, or a man being seen as quarrelsome and difficult in his community, or a man having had some sort of falling out or argument or business dispute with somebody else, and they then want to accuse him, or a man having a religious position that people think is heretical according to the standards of its time. So there are all sorts of reasons. I think ultimately, and this is something I've become more comfortable with, with age. I don't think we know. I think we do the best we can to come up with the explanations that we do, and we keep them under review. And we look at contemporary society and we think about what we feel about that and what we know about that. And we bring that knowledge to bear. And we look at as much historical scholarship as we can and as many statistics as we can and as broad a group of data as we can. And we try and come up with some sort of balanced rationale for why people did this terrible thing to each other and how much it still matters to us. I suppose I feel like what I'm trying to do is push the discussion more towards drawing insights from contemporary life at the moment, particularly when it comes to gender. So I was really pleased with what Suran had done with that. It wasn't a perfect show. There were things I'd have wanted a bit different, or I'd have said, oh, I'm not quite sure about that claim or whatever. But I think what was being done there was really interesting because it was an attempt by somebody to think about the witch trials from the perspective of somebody who feels that she herself is in quite a vulnerable and difficult position. And women in the public eye like her, I think, do feel continually under attack and continually feel like they're the subject of gossip and criticism and marginalisation and underrepresentation and being underestimated and not being given credit for things. And I do think that matters. It's not the whole story, but it does make me look back into history and think, hang on, we recognise this pattern, don't we? Oh, yeah, we've actually lived that pattern. And I do think that feels different to somebody who maybe hasn't lived that pattern and hasn't seen that and hasn't had, I'm in my 50s now, so I've had 50 years of thinking, this isn't fair, this isn't right, this isn't, this isn't, you're misrepresenting me, you're underselling my potential, blah blah, all of that stuff. So I think if we're honest about the baggage that we bring, I think that's fine. People can bring what they want to it and they can take what they want away from it, and I quite like it that we can have that discussion between different kinds of historian and different perspectives.
Mm. It did make me laugh when I was reading up on it and somebody described like Kramer as like a 15th century incel, and I was like,
Mm, yeah.
and I think you can recognize in his sort of stance, unfortunately, quite a lot of viewpoints that you sort of see expressed, usually quite vehemently on social media. And you do think, oh, actually, the more things change, the more they stay the same, or in some cases get worse. So
Yes, they
that
do,
stuff's
and
frustrating.
it's saddening, isn't it? And I do think that the internet has surfaced a lot of that stuff that was always there, and it's quite stark to be presented with it, isn't it? And to think, hang on, that could have been said in 1485. Okay, so why are we still saying it? Why are we still making these same mistakes about scapegoating people and, finding groups that we think, oh, these people are demonic or wicked, or, we don't want them and they're criminal. And it's so frustrating, isn't it? I think it's made me more pessimistic as a person, sadly, because I used to think, oh, well, that's all in the past, isn't it? The era of the witch trials ends in about 1750 and it's all fine. And there are some isolated cases after that. But writing this book, I came more and more to think, I'm not sure this era has really ended. Yes, it's morphed, it's changed. Mostly people who are accused now are accused of witchcraft in a metaphorical sense, although there are still a large group of people around the world who are being accused in a very real sense. I don't think the era of the witch trials has ended, which is such a gloomy thought, isn't it? But I do think it's one that's worth spending some time with and thinking, is that fair? In what ways is that true? In what ways is it not true? In what ways has progress been made? But are there instances where we think, hang on, this is a very familiar pattern. This is very much like a witch trial to me.
It's funny actually how much witch is still used as an insult, because I think most women who've reached any kind of like level of political height, it'll happen to Angela Rayner at some point. I know it will. And I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, a particular media personality had been like flinging disinformation around with merry abandon. And I had said something slightly scathing about it was then. And somebody responded telling me stick to folklore, little witch. And I was like, excuse me, I'll have you know, I'm perfectly average height actually. But I was like, what? A, why would you think I would take that as an insult? And given what I do. And secondly, it's like is that the best you can come up with? And
Mm,
thirdly, it's just like, why is that your defense when I've pointed out the problem with something that you actually don't have a problem with, rather than just going, oh, you have a different point of view to me.
mm,
You've resorted to name calling and that particular name. And
mm.
like I can't imagine somebody would have said that to, if my brother had said the same thing, they wouldn't have said that to him. So I did think it was quite funny. I mean, obviously, I'm a massive position of privilege that I'm in a part of the world where most people just go ho ho, and then that would be the end of it. But yeah, it is kind of fascinating how that keeps resurfacing, that instinct to sort of say that to people.
It makes you think, doesn't it? Yeah. And it's sometimes when people are just reacting kind of off the cuff and something's lurking there in the back of their head and out it's popped. And we all do this. We all, there's the stuff in the back of all of our heads that just comes out in situations of stress or annoyance or whatever. And it's really fascinating, isn't it, that the word witch is in there and just waiting to pop out. And yes, in certain societies, yeah, that could get you killed. In other societies, it's inconvenient, it's unpleasant, but it does draw attention to the fact that somebody's belittling you. In your case, literally, they belittled you, didn't they? Um, and that matters. And yeah, I have, spent some time looking at political cartoons, and you can see the female leaders get it over and over again. People like Julia Gillard in Australia, Liz Truss, Margaret Thatcher, yeah, Angela Rayner, Hillary Clinton. It's going to come up with Kamala Harris, isn't it? We all know it's waiting.
Mm.
And it's the word witch. There are a whole range of other words that people use as well. But fascinated the word witch is still there because really in our society, the word witch shouldn't actually mean that much. When people use the term witch hunt, they're doing it primarily because they want somebody to think, oh, this legal process is just ludicrous. There is no offence here. It's a witch hunt because it's about a crime that doesn't exist. So I am being witch hunted is code for I am being persecuted for no reason. So in that sense, witch means nothing to see here. But yet, curiously, when it's used as an insult about, say, a female politician, suddenly it does mean something then. Oh, that's fascinating, isn't it? Suddenly that does mean, naughty person, demonic adversary, little dismissible person. It means all of those things. So I think that the way that the word witch has hung around in our society is worth noticing.
Mm. I think the last question I've got is, you've probably seen that meme that goes around periodically of like girls with that "we are the granddaughters of the witches you couldn't burn" nonsense. And it's always irritated me because I'm like, first of all, it depends what part of the world you're in, if they were actually burning anyone. So like you might want to get your historical accuracy straight on that one. But secondly, it's like that's cast a major shade on people who were executed compared to ones who weren't. So, and it also assumes that everyone who was accused and executed was actually practicing magic. And I would imagine quite a lot of them probably weren't, or at least not in a, if they were, wouldn't be in a way that we would necessarily recognize. So, do you think that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions about the witch trials, that these people were actually witches?
Yeah, I think it's that. Yes, it's a really interesting debate, that, isn't it? It's very controversial. It's got a lot of baggage. There's a lot of baggage to unpick in that phrase. And I think that's fascinating. It's often very well meant. I think it's important to say that, people are trying to express solidarity with those who were accused in the past, but it does need a bit of pulling out, doesn't it? And as you say, there are issues about different types of punishment. There's issues about whether witchcraft really is still in the past. So, you can't be a grandchild unless it's, well, what, 70 years past, say. It isn't. So I think there are all of those kind of issues to look at. And they're worth having a debate about. But I also think there's something interesting going on when people want to use a slogan like that. What does that mean? Yes, they're trying to identify with something, but sometimes it pays to think a bit harder about what that actually means. And no, I don't think that the people who were accused in the past were necessarily practicing anything in a lot of cases. I think there's some good evidence that A number of them were practicing magic of some sort because again it's a very magical age. So if somebody was ill in your family, you might very well say a charm over them, which you had got from your grandmother or grandfather or whoever. um, or you might do some sort of spell or ritual or charm with them or something like that. Maybe some people did think that they were witches. It must have been quite difficult, I think, if you had grown up thinking that you had some magical power. Say that somebody had said you got second sight, or you're a seer, or you're a natural healer, or something like that. It must have been quite tempting when you fell out with your neighbour who had been really mean to you, not to say, right, I am going to use that power that I have, the connection with whoever it is, God, angels, demons, goblins, other folkloric creatures, fairies. I'm going to use that against you. And I think that might have predisposed people to confess to being witches because at some level they might have thought they were. But I also think there's a massive group of people who have literally done nothing to be suspected. They're just perfectly ordinary farmers' wives or cloth spinners or ploughmen. And this accusation has been flung at them. I do think the accusation of witchcraft can happen to anyone. And I think using a slogan like that is a good starting point for people having a discussion about that.
Yeah, it is funny how it is very much like a slogan that I think people kind of feel they can rally behind. Um, but then how much anybody is then having those deeper
Mm.
conversations obviously remains to be seen.
I
Um,
always like people to have a deep conversation, but it is true that we don't always have them.
yes, particularly on social media, and I think a lot of people have noticed, particularly over like the last 4 years or so, that the ability to have like big discussions, because you used to be able to do that on things like Twitter. Um, all nuance has been stripped out of anything. And
Mm.
you can be having a lovely chat with someone and then someone else will just barrel in and either completely hijack it or just start throwing insults. And you're like,
Mm.
I'm sorry, who are you?
Mm. I think this is the thing about having a society that's become quite polarized, isn't it? And that's one of the things that I think helps me understand the 17th century, very nicely, because that's a really polarized society, and people could start flinging these kind of highly politicized or essentially culture war insults at each other quite easily, which being one of them.
Mm.
I think it really helps to explain what happened in that period. But I do think, yes, if we could move on from that now, we would live in a much better society, and it would be much less easy for somebody to call somebody else a witch, whether they meant it, however they meant it, metaphorically, in reality, whatever. It's something that we need to reflect on, and we do need to have these conversations about, because otherwise, I mean, that's the point of studying history, isn't it? You do it at least in part because you don't want it to be repeated. You don't want there to be a period of witch hunting anywhere in the world. And when there is, you feel like you should try and do something about it. So, yeah, I think conversations like this are really helpful, because if they can help people just unpack that word a bit and notice when the word pops up and think, why is that person having that word thrown at them? Is it because they fall into any of the usual categories of people who were accused in the past? Should we be challenging that? Should we be doing anything about that? Yeah, I think we should, really. I think we should. I think there is still a sense that witch hunting is going on in society, and we need to look at that. We need to stop that.
Mm. I think that's a good moment to end on.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Go forth, go forth and find the witches in your local archive and reflect on the word witch when it pops up in your society and think about what that means.
I love the fact this is the first episode where we're giving people homework.
Yes. Well, I work in education, don't I? Yeah. It's what I do. Yeah, I'll take your essay on on the first day of next week. Thank you so much.
Well, it has been marvelous speaking to you. You've mentioned before that you're working on another book. Do you know roughly when that's due?
Yeah, yes, I do. Yes, I do. Yes, I do know when it's due. I have to write it first, don't I? It'll be out in 2026, and it doesn't have a title yet, but it will be about the Witchfinder General hunt, if you like, of the mid 17th century, the English Civil War. But it will also look at a range of other cases on each side of that East Anglian hunt, the big one that people know about, including in other places up to and including Cornwall, Scotland, Newcastle, etc. So it'll be very exciting.
I look forward to that one because I think obviously you're biased, but Newcastle ones tend to kind of fly under the radar a little bit. And considering how many people were involved and what the male witch was accused of being
Mm.
able to do, I mean, he's got a whole list of things he can apparently do, and you just think, why is this not more well known? But
Yes, I think it should be. And I try what I'm going to try and do is bring some of those cases into that discussion about the big witch hunt that people know about, because I think it's a really important context and they're really important cases in their own right.
cool. Well, it's been lovely chatting to you.
That was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
It's not a problem. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record, and edit these episodes. So if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.